This video is the second of a six-part series about the Great Migration. The videos are intended in part to act as a handout and supplement to the one-hour in-person class presented at RootsTech 2023. Subsequently, some of the same information provided in the one-hour class is included, but amplified by these videos. There is also a printed handout available that contains the script of the in-person class and each of the 6 individual series videos with footnotes to each source and an extensive bibliography. The videos are presented in sequence and are best viewed in order. The Great Migration involved the movement of over 6 million formerly enslaved African Americans and their freeborn children from the southern states to other parts of the United States between 1915 and 1970. Although slavery had technically ended at the end of the Civil War, the oppression of the African American population continued unabated. Many of the formerly enslaved people became indentured servants or sharecropping tenants, farmers, living under the same or worse conditions that they had suffered under slavery. The severe economic exploitation of the blacks in the South began during the Jim Crow era in about 1880. The subsequent passage of extreme, complicated segregation laws created a society of terror among the former enslaved people, which included the threat of systematic violence and the complete imposition of political disenfranchisement. After a short period of hope, the South began to systematically impose oppressive laws that collectively became known as the Jim Crow laws, based upon the name used by a minstrel performer named Thomas Dartmouth Rice about 1830. Quoting from Britannica.com, he, Thomas Dartmouth Rice, portrayed the Jim Crow character principally as a dim-witted buffoon, building on and highlighting contemporary negative stereotypes of the African Americans. Jim Crow came to be a derogatory term for black people, and in the late 19th century, it became the identifier for the laws that reinstated white supremacy in the South after the Reconstruction. The demeaning character symbolically rationalized segregation and the denial of equal opportunity. Each of the 6 videos highlights an individual or a family that was involved in leaving the South and moving to a city in the North, the West, or the Northeast. The cities are selected based on the numbers of migrants. Each individual or family was gleaned from the 1950 U.S. Census and then researched back in time to discover their origins with genealogically valuable records. The family chosen for this video lived in New York City. There was no organized mass movement. The Great Migration consisted of the decisions of individuals and families to leave the South and move to another area of the country that promised relief from the oppression and danger of living under Jim Crow laws and practices. It is only through looking at the lives of those who made their own decision to leave the South and spend their lives in another extremely different way and place that we can begin to understand the why and how of the Great Migration. For this reason, my emphasis in this presentation and in the videos that follow show how we begin learning about those individual lives. Quoting from a Wikipedia article entitled African Americans in New York City, African Americans constitute one of the longer-running ethnic presences in New York City, the largest urban African American population and the world's largest black population of any city outside Africa by a significant margin. The majority of the African American population were sold from their villages in West and Central Africa and brought to the American South via the Atlantic slave trade. The black community consists of immigrants and their descendants from Africa, the Caribbean, as well as native-born African Americans. Many of the city's black residents live in Brooklyn, Queens, Harlem, and the Bronx. Several of the city's neighborhoods are historical birthplaces of urban black culture in America, among them the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant and Manhattan's Harlem, and various sections of eastern Queens and the Bronx. Bedford-Stuyvesant is considered to have the highest concentration of black residents in the United States. Beginning in 1904, a real estate entrepreneur, Philip A. Payton, Jr., established an Afro-American realty company and began to actively sell real estate in the predominantly white city of Harlem. Quoting from an article about Harlem, New York from encyclopedia.com, in 1890, there were approximately 25,000 African Americans in Manhattan. By 1910, that number had more than tripled to 90,000. In the following decade, the black population increased to approximately 150,000 and more than doubled by 1930 to over 325,000. In Harlem itself, the black population rose from approximately 50,000 in 1914 to about 80,000 in 1920 to about 200,000 by 1930. Quoting from a public broadcasting system feature entitled Newspapers, the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender, which was founded by Robert S. Abbott on May 5, 1905, once heralded itself as the world's greatest weekly. The newspaper was the nation's most influential black weekly newspaper by the advent of World War I, with more than two-thirds of its readership base located outside of Chicago. The Chicago Defender was the first black newspaper to have a circulation over 100,000, the first to have a health column, and the first to have a full page of comic strips. During World War I, the Chicago Defender waged its most aggressive and successful campaign to support the Great Migration movement. This movement resulted in over 1.5 million Southern blacks migrating to the North between 1915 and 1925. The 1950 U.S. Census shows Walter Gates, born in about 1919 in Mississippi. He is working pressing clothes at a cleaning plant. Unlike previous census records, the 1950 census does not show the birthplace of his parents. His wife's name is Edith, who was born in Alabama, and he has a 10-year-old child named Juanita, who was born in New York. Starting research with the 1950 U.S. Census immediately opens up a wealth of other possible records. In the case of Walter Gates, On Record Hints immediately supplied a World War II draft registration card dated 16 October 1940, showing his birth date and birthplace on 20 August 1918 in Gulfport, Mississippi. He was working at the time for Like New Cleaning in New York City. The goal here is to open a window into the 19th century with people born before 1900. The draft registration card gives us a way to identify Walter in the 1940 U.S. Census. It also gives us a way to estimate his marriage date and provides the name of his brother, William Gates, who was also living in New York. There have always been business records, but the challenge to genealogists is that they are seldom identified as genealogical records. Governments from the earliest times have issued permits and licenses to allow businesses to operate. Employment records may or may not have been reserved, but when the other types of records seem to fail, employment can be a substantial help in differentiating between individuals with the same or very similar names. An additional record, a Social Security Death Index record, records his death date as May of 1987. At this point, we still need to identify his parents and his wife's maiden name. However, with his Social Security number, I found his Social Security application form, with his parents' names, including his mother's maiden name. One underlying challenge is always people with the same names. It's important to focus on the places and work down through the results before making a snap judgment and adding the wrong person. The number of results from any search for a person with a common name can be intimidating. A name search on one of the major genealogical family tree websites will show you fairly quickly the frequency of any name. You may be surprised at first to see how common some names are. As research continued, I found a 1910 U.S. Census for Albert Gates, listing his wife and children in Gulfport, Mississippi, giving his estimated birth date of 1868. He is employed as a laborer in a warehouse. You can see that we now have a window back into the 1800s. You don't always find records in chronological order. This is the case with finding the 1930 U.S. Census for Jane Gates and her family living at 83-84 Railroad Street in Gulfport, Harrison County, Mississippi. Apparently, sometime between 1912 and 1930, her husband had died or was not with the family at the time of the census. Jane and her two oldest children were all shown as employed. As I kept looking for additional records, I found the 1920 U.S. Census showing Jane Gates as the head of the household. The 1920 U.S. Census shows Jane as a widow. Each time another record is found, additional records are suggested by Ancestry.com as record hints. This is what happens in many cases with individuals who lived in the 20th century. There also appear to be a smattering of some ancestry family trees that include Walter Gates. This gives a relative or descendant the opportunity to try and contact family members for additional information. When I explain the research process, there may be some who would conclude that finding someone like this example is easy. I can say that the huge online database programs facilitate research, but just because I was able to find all this information is not a good indication of what someone else might encounter. Only one of the three other family trees, including Walter Gates, had any sources listed for him. One of the trees lists his wife's name as Jessie May Gates, and another lists his wife as Edith Iola Evans. There are no family members listed in the third family tree entry. The 1950 U.S. Census that I've already mentioned lists his wife as Edith. These examples point out that following the record trail is not always straightforward. At this point, there are several unanswered questions, such as clarifying whether or not Walter Gates' father, Albert, had more than one wife. However, as noted, Jane Gates, Walter's mother, is listed as a widow in the 1920 U.S. Census. Walter is listed as being 2 years old, so his father, Albert, must have left or died between 1917 and 1920. Albert's birth year was listed in the 1910 U.S. Census as 1868, making him at least 49 years old. It is very unlikely at this point that Albert had more than one wife, despite Ancestry's family trees to the contrary. We need to remember to analyze and record all the information from all the record sources that we find. Walter's mother's maiden name was found to be Jane Sudds. It is important to examine all the records hints for all of the family members and do additional research from other sources. A findagrave.com entry shows that she was born about 1880 and died in Gulfport, Harrison County, Mississippi in 1961. She is apparently buried in the old Mississippi City Cemetery. Mississippi City, Mississippi is an unincorporated community in Harrison County that is now part of Gulfport. As the original county seat for Harrison County, Mississippi, Mississippi City was one of the most important towns on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in the latter half of the 19th century. It is important to understand the history of the places where the events in the lives of the people you are researching occurred. Searching for a death record of Albert Gates, Walter's father, immediately showed people with the same name in the same area of the country. The trail extends to Alabama right after the end of the Civil War. It is important to continue to research in the 1900s because any additional information, such as the marriage record for Albert and Jane Sudds, might provide clues to further identifying Albert Gates. Learning about the Great Migration continues. There is really no end to the research that can be done and the discoveries that can be made. There are always more records. The next video, number 3 in the series, will continue with research about a family beginning in Detroit, Michigan. Thanks for watching.